This is George Galloway for كلمة on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting كلمة where every word is free. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, but discussing an issue which has swept the world, literally swept the world. A tidal wave of biblical proportions, of hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of refugees who are either at this moment walking down railway lines, besieging railway stations, camped out in Calais, in France, everywhere in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people are on the move in numbers that have not been seen in the European continent since the end of the Second World War. It is causing a great deal of perplexing bewilderment on the part of policymakers who don't seem to realize that their own actions are the cause of this triggering of this mass influx of refugees. They try to mask the problem by calling them migrants, as if migrants were somehow a bad thing. If immigration was a bad thing, America would be the poorest country in the world and Bangladesh would be the richest. But everybody who knows anything about economics knows that migration makes the economic heart beat faster, circulates the blood better, brings in new blood of working age people who go on to make a significant contribution. In the very place, the very port where my grandparents arrived in their bare feet, they lived long enough by the grace of God to see me elected as the Member of Parliament for that very port, that very place where they first set their bare feet, making the point that the immigrant story is generally a positive one, at least for the societies to which the immigrants come, even if many immigrants suffer all kinds of indignities, bigotry, discrimination, and worse for many, many decades after their families have arrived here. So that's one of the issues, migration. How legitimate is it? But the bigger issue is the issue of refugees. Now let's get one thing straight. The vast majority of the refugees on the march or trying to get on the march on the high seas are refugees from the very countries that Britain and France and the United States and Germany and other European countries have been bombing over the last 15 years or so. That's just a fact. Most of the current wave of refugees are coming from either Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, you don't have to be Einstein to work out the connection between those three countries and us. In fact, if I was to choose one of the sources, and one of the most heartbreaking for me, it is Syria. Most actually, of the people flooding out of Syria were not just of good working age, they were also, in many, many cases, of military age, and therefore no longer available to defend the Syrian Arab Republic against the foreign invasion and occupation of at least 40%, maybe 50% of their country. They are fleeing, of course, from the bombs and munitions of both sides in this foreign invasion of Syria, but they are nonetheless fleeing because there is a war in Syria, and I shall now turn to that. Turkey, which has suddenly begun facilitating and bringing down the cost of the fleeing of refugees from Turkey to Europe, is one of the principal actors in this drama. Turkey has been the open door through which the foreign invasion and occupation of Syria has been facilitated in both directions. The stolen oil, the stolen artifacts and treasures go out through Turkey, and the Takfiri fanatic fighters of ISIS and Al-Qaeda enter Syria through Turkey. But many other countries have contributed. Britain and France were bombing Syria, in the British case through subterfuge under cloak and dagger. Britain and the United States and many other countries participated in the assault, invasion and occupation and destruction, actually, of Iraq before that. Afghanistan, they were all there. Virtually every country in the world attacked and occupied Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world. And the result, hey presto, is hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and there could soon be millions of the citizens of those three countries and some more on the march. And when they get to Europe, most European countries are slamming the door in their face. We'll be discussing this with an expert audience of real experts and gifted amateurs like me. Much liberal commentary is occupied by the argument about how many refugees each people should take. I don't want any refugees. I want the refugees to go back to their countries. I don't want the refugees to be bombed out of their countries. I say stop bombing, stop invading, stop occupying other people's countries, and you won't have refugees. You'll still have migrants. And we'll turn to that, no doubt, in the course of this debate. But we've assembled a wonderful audience here in London who've all got their own views. كلمة means free word, and they're all free to speak their words here this evening. And the first speaker is you, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, George. You spoke about refugees, but refugees is a legal term according to the 1951 Convention on the Treatment of Asylum Seekers, and anybody having that status, it needs to be applied according to a criteria. Until then, people are irregular migrants. So there is actually a migrant crisis until, of course, you can determine that someone is actually fearing persecution or just have the fear of persecution in their home country. Then, of course, they have the right to go and seek a refuge within any state that they so wish and can breach any laws within reason to get to a country. But this is actually a migration issue that began the first instance, of course, with, the Western involvement, undermining governments within Syria and, of course, Iraq and Libya, as you rightly said. But the real genesis at the moment was Germany opening up its borders, saying it will take 10,000 people. And that, of course, created this mass movement to get to Germany, essentially, because really most people do want to get to Germany. But we have a system that is not fit for purpose. We can't just remove borders, because that will create anarchy and opportunity for criminals. But the current situation where people are just crossing because one government says you can come is just helping the people, smugglers, those who trade in people's misery. And, of course, I think Germany has an ulterior motive. It has a demographic crisis, and they want to get access to cheaper labour, which they can then exploit. And you rightly said about how people were highly qualified coming from countries such as Syria to go and work in Germany or even in Britain or Sweden, serving us coffee. That is not a meaningful use of their time when they could be in their own country. What we need to do is solve the problems in Syria. We need to stop undermining the government of President Assad and try and help people in their own countries. I know it's understandable that people will come. I've visited refugee camps in Turkey and the conditions are appalling, so it's thoroughly understandable. But until we get to the core of the crisis in Syria, we stop undermining legitimate governments, we'll just have more of this. And if we're encouraging more people to come, then more people will be just paying people smugglers, being exploited, and then, of course, coming to Western countries to be further exploited in the black economy.
Well, I agree with almost all of that. I just make this caveat that ipso facto, if there's a war in your country and you flee from it, you're a refugee. Because although the bombs are not specifically aimed at you, you could hardly make the case that someone should have stayed in order to be bombed just because the bomb wasn't aimed specifically at them. So in nearly 30 years as a British Member of Parliament, I'm used to dealing with a lot of asylum seekers, not all of whom were really asylum seekers. Many of them were economic migrants, like my own grandparents were. But these are genuine refugees because they're fleeing raging war. Moreover, a war being facilitated by, and in many cases participated in, by the countries to which they are fleeing. So with that caveat, I agree with all that you said. Germany has acted in its own self-interest very cleverly, much more cleverly than Britain. Britain's not only going to take a pitiful number of refugees, they're going to take them from the refugee camps, to which I'm going to turn in a second. Whereas the richer, better educated, more resourceful refugees are the ones who are arriving in Europe, and they're the ones that Germany is taking. And I'm not sure that they will have them serving coffee. Those 3 surgeons that were on the boat will get jobs pretty quick as surgeons. Unfortunately, it'll be in Germany rather than in Syria. Britain is taking 4,000 a year for the next 5 years, which is utterly risible. And they're going to take them from amongst the poorest, least educated, least resourceful people. I don't get involved in the liberal numbers game about how many refugees we're taking, because I'm not a liberal. I'm against the wars, and I want the people to return to their own countries. But if you are going to make a war and millions of people spill out to the neighboring countries, to just turn your back, as they have done. I saw someone from the United Nations on the television yesterday saying that they have a winter funding crisis in Lebanon and in Jordan coming up very soon. You, sir, are, I think, Lebanese. Why don't you respond to that point?
Khoury, I'm a producer and online content manager at Levant TV. Now, speaking of Lebanon, before touching on Lebanon, and obviously we know much about refugees there, be they Syrian or otherwise, throughout the civil war where the country was struggling as it is with its own problems.
Refugees for more than half a century. Yes.
So, speaking of what you just discussed with Mr. Olds, is who is better for Britain compared to who is better for Germany. Now, you just said that Germany is taking the young, working, able-bodied people, educated and all that, and that reminds me of an article in The Guardian last week about a German Renaissance expected. I can't remember the name of the writer in The Guardian, but is it really ethically acceptable to look at those people as commodities, so as, oh, let's get the clever ones, let's get the young ones, let's get the tax-paying ones who can fund our aging baby boomers eventually, like the demographic problem in Germany. So is it really valid to discuss this? I mean, us in Lebanon, be it with the refugees from Syria or Palestine, we always looked at them and extended our hands to them and hoping that they will return and welcome them. We never really looked at how to sort of use them in a way to contribute to our economy or our tax system, which doesn't even exist. But is it really valid?
Well, it's valid to discuss it because it's a reality. The ethics and morality of taking the intellectual cream of a country that you're helping to destabilize and make war on is a no-brainer. It's the most immoral, unethical thing that you can imagine, but that's what they are doing. I don't mean to insult the people who are in the camps, of course, in Lebanon or in Jordan. Quite often they're not on the march because they've got large families and they can't take all their children and their elderly parents and so on.
But that's why maybe the Prime Minister's plan is to get those most vulnerable people.
Our Prime Minister?
Mr. Cameron, yes.
Yes, but only 4,000 a year. I mean,
is it always about numbers? Because at the end of the day, it's all about how they're going to be absorbed into the British fabric.
Well, but 4,000, my dear. I stood in a queue of 4,000 at Gatwick Airport today just to get through. In one hall were 4,000 people. This is a pitiful, risible ridiculous number. But the fact that he's taking them from the camps is probably ethically better than what Germany is doing. But then Britain is contributing to the destabilization of the countries from which the refugees are fleeing far more than Germany is. Germany wasn't in the war on Iraq. We were the number 2 in the war on Iraq. Germany is not routinely bombing Iraq and Syria today, did not help build up the monster that is ISIS to anything like the
But then, speaking of ISIS, sorry to interrupt, obviously Germany is now welcoming many young, fit-bodied people. Reports from in the media are proving that there used to be fighters in ISIS. So would we want Britain to do the same?
Well, I don't think that the reports are proving this. Certainly it is being alleged that they are by right-wing journalists and right-wing xenophobes who don't want any immigrants at all. They're saying, hey, look there, that young fellow, he looks like he might be able to handle an AK-47. How can we know that? In any case, we are the people who built ISIS. We are the people who made it the power that it is today, and Al-Qaeda, and the other so-called moderate rebels, moderate heart-eaters. So who are we to say, to look through the refugees on the road and say, that one there looks like he's a rum character. Yes?
You spoke about wanting to rebuild Syria, and you would prefer many of the Syrian refugees to be able to go back to their own country. That's if we actually prevented ourselves from interfering and undermining the regime of, or the government of President Assad. But really, if we're just going to take some refugees, then that will be even more. And then, in a sense, we're doing ISIS's, Daesh's job for them of ethnically cleansing everybody that they're opposed to. So we need to be very careful, or we'll just depopulate Syria of its best and brightest.
ISIS obviously allowed these people to pass. Turkey allowed them to pass. The cost of crossing fell from 20,000 per family to 5,000 per family. Somebody's paying the difference. The people smugglers aren't taking a cut of 75%. Someone, somewhere, decided that now would be a good time to send a massive flood of refugees to Europe. Now, I can't prove this, but I believe that it's the Turkish state who took that decision, and I believe their reasoning was that if you make this crisis a super crisis for the European powers, you will draw the European powers into the war more directly than they are already into it. That's the game, I believe, that's being played. Who would like to speak who hasn't yet? We mustn't monopolize things.
Okay, so my name is Ami. I'm a director of the immigration company, and I'm deal with these cases, every day. So with many of these cases, I think from my point of view, this is, I think, the game. This is the game of the British and the Europe to try to get closer to the Asian country and try to go there and start, expanding their power in there. I'm not sure about this, but when I just think in this side, to see exactly as just like you said, that why this year is happened and why not last year is happened, why not the next year will happen, because now, because of the IS and the Daesh, this is a very, hot, condition at the moment that for people to, start, making any problem for them. And they try, I think, these countries in Europe, especially British and in the United States, they try to, make some problem in the, these countries and then get the people out of this. And then by train them, as you said, by getting, the good people from them, behave very nice with them, not now, but in the future, behave very nice and try to, absorb all of them and just think that, and put this imagination in all the people from all the world that we are a very good guy, we are very good countries, we accept all the people from all the world. But now, on the behind, so they're just going closer and closer to those countries to start and, vast and expanding all the, powers, not just in Europe, because of, many things that I think you would be better for me. What do you think about this? Well,
I think that the twin drivers of not just refugees but immigration are, first of all, war and occupation and destabilization, and secondly, poverty. My grandparents didn't leave Ireland because they didn't love Ireland. They spoke Irish, which is very difficult when they got here. They left Ireland because they were hungry, because they were on the point and had just seen mass starvation and famine. So they came to a place where they thought that if they worked hard, they would live better. And that's, of course, true. But if we count on immigration to solve that problem, the rich countries are going to get richer and richer, the poor countries poorer and poorer, and more of them are going to have to leave the poor, increasingly poor countries to try to get to the rich countries. And then the world will turn upside down. So I'm not an advocate of mass immigration any more than I'm an advocate of mass refugee influxes. If we shared the wealth of the world more equally, had proper, just trading and other arrangements with the poor world, fewer people would want to leave. After all, most people would prefer, other things being equal, to continue to live in their own country. We'll be right back. Still watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing the refugee crisis, the crisis of migration. A crisis for the receiving countries, maybe, but definitely a crisis for the countries from which the refugees and the immigrants are exiting. Now, we took the cameras, Al Mayadeen's camera team, out onto the streets of London today to hear what they thought. That's what's coming up now. Watch this.
What do you think of the recent refugee crisis?
Well, I think that the government needs to be doing more to take in genuine cases for people who actually are having to flee from troubles and need to be taken care of.
Right, it's very sad, it's a very difficult situation, but I think David Cameron has got the right idea to have taken the refugees from the camps.
Well, I think it's Britain's responsibility to take their fair share of refugees into the country, seeing as countries such as Germany are taking quite a lot.
Who is responsible for them? Do you think should Europe countries give them asylum?
Should the European countries give them asylum? Yes, I mean I think it should be spread out across all of Europe because clearly it's a problem that will affect everybody, and asking any one country to take the burden of that would be unacceptable and also probably unfair and impractical.
Oh yeah, definitely. Why not? They should all given all the basic facilities of life. Whatever we can offer them, we should definitely give them. Like any other human being, we should not put any differences between all these refugees and the people who are already living in this country.
Well, that was the view of the people on the streets of London. Let's continue to garner the views of the people here in the audience, in the studio in London. Yes, sir, at the back.
Good evening. My name is Ahmed and I'm a politics student here in London. I'd like to start this evening by making reference to a quote by the beautifully gifted Somali poet Warsan Shire, where she says that no parent would have ever put their kids in a boat had they not known that the waters were safer than the land. I think her words could not be more true. Today, in correspondence with what's just been said, a recent EU commissioned report sheds light on the influx of refugees making their way from Syria into, or at least from the Middle East generally, into Europe, with Italy being their ultimate destination, or at least a portal towards their ultimate destination. I'd like to ask the murderers and the cowards in Europe, the murderers, David Cameron and Barack Obama, amongst many others, if they knew what that number stood at in 2010, the year before they started their imperialist program in Syria, how many Syrian refugees made their way through that particular route. The number stood at 0. A year later, it stood at 92. 5 years on, the figure falls just short of 10,000. Now, I've got good reason to believe that when they started their brutal and inhumane program, they knew full well the consequences that they were bringing about. I don't for a second believe that this is an issue of their incompetence. I think it's an issue of their inhumanity. You know, I don't think that it's a mistake. I think when they started their bombing campaigns in Libya, when they started arming these so-called moderate rebels in Syria, they knew full well that, you know, a few years on, we're going to expect, you know, dead bodies washing up on shores in Europe. They knew full well that we're going to expect a mass influx of refugees coming to these lands. Would you agree with me? Would you say that it was a mistake that they were expecting, or would you say that they knew full well what they were doing and the consequences that they were bringing about?
It's a beautifully expressed argument that you make. I just add this caveat that having been up close and personal with our leaders in Britain for almost 30 years, in Parliament with them, it would be a mistake to imagine that our leaders are James Bonds. They are more Austin Powers than James Bonds. Don't imagine that they are very clever people who always have fiendish plans which always work according to clockwork. I don't believe that that's true. That doesn't exculpate them, of course. It might even be better to be ruled by knaves than to be ruled by fools. But I believe we're ruled by people who are a mixture of both. In my film on Tony Blair, which is coming out very soon, we use a clip of Barack Obama talking about the rise of ISIS, making the point that ISIS arose out of Al-Qaeda, which arose out of he said, our invasion of Iraq, which was why I opposed it, he said, and is an example of the law of unintended consequence. And a reason why, I'm quoting Barack Obama, President Obama, a reason why we should generally aim before we shoot, implying that Bush and Blair did not aim before they started shooting. Now, I believe, in this instance at least, that President Obama is sincere. I think that he believes that the horrific consequences of the invasion and destruction of Iraq were not the intention of the invaders. I agree with them. It's possible to take a different view. Some of my friends do take a different view. But I don't think that they invaded and destroyed Iraq thinking it would lead to 100,000 army of head-cutting, heart-eating ISIS fanatics on the march and spilling everywhere around the world, including, as we await any day, onto the streets of our own cities. I don't believe that they intended that. I believe that that was an easily foreseeable outcome, so easily foreseeable that even I, who left school at 15, was able to see it and tell them repeatedly in Parliament, on television, on the streets, that this is what will happen. I could see it. All these expensively educated, well-remunerated ambassadors and ministers apparently could not see it. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, I'm sure if you ask any one of us in the studio right now, you know, we knew exactly what was happening 4 years ago. And why is it that you as a 15-year-old knew exactly what the consequences of the actions would bring about? And in terms of Obama identifying the mistake of Bush and Blair of them not aiming before they shoot, why did he not aim before he shot at the Libyans in 2011? No, why did he not do his research to understand that the only people he was helping in 2011 were the Al-Qaeda militants in the east of Libya?
No, I agree entirely. It doesn't invalidate the first statement that he made similar decisions of a catastrophic nature himself later. I would, if I was trying to make a case for President Obama, it would be that he was not the principal criminal in Libya. The principal criminal in Libya was Sarkozy and Cameron. They were the people who drove the war drive against Libya. They actually, just as Blair had done with Bill Clinton in the Balkans in the Kosovan crisis, it was the European part of NATO that was driving the most aggressive policy. But you're right, the destruction of Libya, about which we don't hear so much as we did a few weeks ago, opened a gate through a state which no longer exists for mass influx of refugees. Most of the refugees are now coming from Turkey to Greece, and thence through the Balkans and headed, if they can, for Germany. We have another refugee problem at Calais, a small one actually, of people trying to reach Britain. Almost all of them from former colonies of Britain and who are English speakers, as any journalist who's gone there knows. Who else would like to come in? Yes, the lady in front there.
Good evening. I read somewhere that we can look at this crisis as a fight between two civilizations, the Middle East civilization and the European civilization. In fact, it was mentioned that we can consider this crisis as a fight between Islamism and all the democratic values of European countries. To what extent do you agree with this? Can we consider it a fight between Islamism and that type of civilization in Middle East and the democratic values in European countries?
Well, I'm reminded of the words of Mr. Gandhi, the Indian independence leader, when asked by an American journalist what he thought of Western civilization. Mr. Gandhi answered, yes, that would be a good idea. In other words, I question what the Western civilization is in this equation, but I'd also, to rearrange the metaphor, question what was the Islamist civilization. I know Syria very well, and I know Iraq very well. I don't know everywhere very well. I don't know Libya very well, but I know these two countries very well. And I know that neither of them contains more than a quite small minority of Islamists. Syria and Iraq were countries where faiths, some of them quite obscure faiths, like the Yazidis, for example, not only lived in harmony with each other, but were multinational, multi-confessional, multi-faith societies. I've visited some of the holiest Christian places I have ever been in, much holier than the Vatican and Rome, where the people speak the language of Jesus himself, which are in pristine condition, or were, and which were treasured by everybody in Syria. Even though the Christians were a minority, they were treated like a kind of crown jewels, because they testified to the fact that Syria was a civilized country. I'm not talking about the political regime. I'm not a supporter of the political regime in Syria, and I never have been. But the society, Syrian society, treasured the presence of Arabs and Kurds and Druze and Christians and Alawiyin Muslims, often in shorthand described as Shiite Muslims, and of course the Sunni majority. So I don't see much civilization on either side of this equation, quite candidly. Yes, sir.
So touching on minorities, which you just mentioned, be it Christians, Druze, Yazidis in Iraq or in Syria, and how they were so cherished and well kept back in their home country under the Assad government. Now, when it comes to migration, obviously we've seen the body of a young boy on the shores of the Mediterranean, obviously didn't make it on that boat. Now, we've also seen recently that a Christian girl was sold by ISIS. Now, there's a difference here when it comes to media coverage in general, when it comes to migrants, and when it comes to protecting minority rights. Now, why, when the Christians in the Middle East or the Yazidis are supposedly, in the eyes of all the locals, the ones that contributed a lot to the educational systems over there and all that, why does the West not offer them any organized immigration? And like you mentioned before, many of them are doctors, be it Christians or Muslims. Why don't they go through a regular immigration process, just like the Lebanese during the Civil War went to Canada, Australia, and other countries through immigration channels where they qualify, and they do qualify, and they need not any assistance from the government. And yes, you touched on the opinions of the Londoners, but then go up north and you see for yourself, especially in the northeast, the attitude towards immigration, be it from Europe or the Middle East. Now, if we reassure English people that those people will come through immigration channels that are legal, paid for their visas, need no sponsorship because they are well off back home, they could sell their properties or they could easily work and sustain a living. If we start with those, and then the government will have spare money to get the most vulnerable ones.
Well, you and I have a profound disagreement. I don't want these people to come. Not because I hate foreigners, I love foreigners. In fact, I'm usually accused of loving them too much. But I don't want them to come here. Why? Because I want them to stay in their own country. I don't want the educationalists. Still less do I want the Christians to leave the Middle East. Why would we want to give special visas to Christians to empty the Middle East of Christians? We want the Christians to stay where Christianity came into existence. We don't want all the Christians to leave their countries and come here. That would be an absolute tragedy if that happened. A better question, if I may say so, sir, is that the existence of Christian populations in Iraq, which I knew well, used to regularly go to Mass in Damascus, in Baghdad, a Mass attended by huge numbers, especially at Christmas time, Easter time, huge numbers. These Christians have been driven out of Iraq by first the invasion and occupation and the sectarianism which has been generated by that invasion and that occupation. And the same is now true of Syria. These places, Malula and others, are now mainly empty of Christians who have had to flee to Damascus to avoid having their heads cut off by ISIS, their churches destroyed, their religious artifacts filmed. They film it on YouTube so you can see them smashing Mary, see them smashing the figure of Jesus. They want you. They advertise their bestiality. Why do we? Or the same as in Palestine. The bishops and the archbishops of the Christian churches in Palestine beg for the Christians in the West to notice them and do something for them. Instead, the Christians in the West support the Zionist occupation, which is destroying them and their position in the society. We'll be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing the refugee crisis and who is responsible for it. Temperatures rising here in the studio. Let's take another of our distinguished audience. Yes, sir, in the middle.
Salah al-Bandar. I really find it very difficult to compare suffering, and it's very indecent as well. But all the time we discuss the byproducts, the refugee crisis, the suffering of people around the globe from all these policies. And I think the time has come for us to step forward and organize something positive by setting up an international criminal court, a popular one, by the mass movement, in fact, to put these perpetrators in the spotlights and holding them accountable for what have been doing for the last, I see, 20, maybe 40 years, modeled around the Nuremberg. In Nuremberg, after the Second World War, the West and the international humanity, in fact, tried all these fascists. At the same time, gave our sense of conscience a new page. I think the time has come for us to do this, and I was wondering if you personally, or Al Mayadeen TV, really try to accept this proposal and take it one step forward. Thank you.
Well, I'm ready to be a judge. If you don't want me to be the prosecutor, I'd prefer to be the prosecutor, and it's a good idea, but it's a very big idea. First of all, in order to have such a tribunal, you have to have a country in which it was free to set it up and to organize it. You need very considerable resources to pay for the staff and the research, the building of the case, and to staff the court. You need money to bring in witnesses and so on. And that leaves very, very few places that have the resources and the willingness to do that. But it's a good idea. If Prime Minister Mahathir was still in power in Malaysia, maybe that's a place where such a thing could have been assembled. Malaysia, a rich country, majority Muslim country with a sympathetic political leadership as it then had, might have been a place that we could have this. Maybe South Africa, itself now free at least of apartheid, if not of other problems, might be another place that that could happen. Let's see if your call finds an echo anywhere in amongst the audience. Yes, madam.
Hello, I'm not really accustomed to this type of a debate,
welcome.
an open debate. What I would say is that I work with social workers, and we're at the front line with regards to asylum seekers, young people who come across and actually get into the country, and saw the issues around how we treat asylum seekers and how they actually, you know, are able to stay in the country. Because a lot of what's happening now is about the ones that have got through, whether or not they can actually remain in the country, and the issues about, you may know more about this in terms of, you know, them becoming asylum seekers. Because I understand, like, for example, in Hungary now, they've actually saying no way is anybody coming through anymore through Serbia. In the past, they've said I think they've said 14 people are asylum seekers, or
well,
you know, legal asylum
Hungary,
seekers.
I think, with a very right-wing government and an even more right-wing mass movement, proto-fascist movement, is definitely going to be inhospitable to refugees and asylum seekers, still more to migrants. And the Hungarian media is on a par with the British media for racist, xenophobic treatment. You saw the camera woman from a television station tripping up and kicking refugees running for their lives as they thought, as they saw it. She became a hero in Hungary. She became a villain to any decent person anywhere in the world, but her Twitter and Facebook and all her profiles went mad. She's seen as a hero by the xenophobic hard right in Hungary. Germany has now closed its border, so we now have the makings of a real crisis, because the backing up in countries that the people don't want to be in, and countries which don't want them to be in, is going to be the story, I think, of the next few weeks.
And I suppose my issue, you know, realistically, what my concern is what are we influencing our government in terms of our influence to do their bit, you know.
Well, we have a government.
You know, the 20,000 or whatever over the next 5 years is
no, it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
And looking at what we can do, I know you're saying that the issue is about people going back to where they come from, but realistically, we have to deal with what's going on now. And it's what we can say, yes, it's best for you to return back to your country. Realistically, that isn't best for them. They have taken, you know, the responsibility, the decision to leave their country for the reasons of war And we're not just talking about refugees from, or asylum seekers from Syria. We get quite a few unaccompanied minors coming from Eritrea. We've got unaccompanied minors coming from Iran. We've had quite a few unaccompanied minors coming from Albania. These are all countries around the world, war-torn countries, that are experiencing...
Well, every one of those you mentioned are countries that have either been attacked by us, or in the case of Iran, sanctioned by us. We don't quite fancy attacking Iran because we get a pretty bloody nose. So we instead put crippling economic sanctions on Iran, which no doubt produces these unaccompanied minors that you refer to. Eritrea is a product of, first of all, is under complete sanction because of political disagreements between the so-called international community and the regime in Eritrea. So I'm not disagreeing with you. We have a duty to fairly and justly deal with the consequences of our actions, but it's much more important that we stop our actions. Because, as I've just, I think, hope demonstrated, there is no limit to what those consequences could be. I mean, all of Africa, from the conflicts and poverty that exist, all Africa could come here. But that's not a good thing. It wouldn't be a question of how liberal we were towards millions of Africans arriving. We don't want millions of Africans arriving. We want to have an international system whereby Africa can develop so that Africans can live in dignity and prosperity, increasing prosperity in Africa. So that's why I don't like getting into the numbers game. It's what distinguishes me from The Guardian or other liberal commentators. Of course, and as I said, I've dealt with this for almost 30 years. If a refugee arrives, you have to deal with them justly. But that's not a case for saying, let's agree to bring 1 million Syrians to Britain. I'm against that. I'm against it. Yes, sir.
Of course, there's as you all know from your casework, there's a housing issue amongst British citizens trying to find decent housing in this country.
Although that's not the fault of the immigrants or the refugees.
Absolutely not, no.
You know, one of the things I always point out, when they say Britain is full, Britain is almost completely empty. Only 5% of Britain is built upon. 95% of it is empty.
We have the highest, England has the highest density of population within the developed world, but I'd just like to say that...
It's 5%.
Well, it's the highest density in the developed world.
Maybe, but it's 5%.
But I'd just like to say that this isn't the only refugee crisis. There was, of course, a million people that have fled East Ukraine to get away from the armed forces of the Kiev junta, who have gone to seek refuge or migrated, however you want to look at it, in Russia, which brings me on to how, according to Western media, how Russia is looking to get a solution to the problems in Syria by increasing, according to Western media, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt, but if it's to be believed, Mr. Putin is giving more support to President Assad in Syria, a legitimate Syrian government. Iran is standing by Syria. Now, instead of Barack Obama, who he turned a blind eye to ISIS for many years, it was only when ISIS took control of Mosul in Iraq that, of course, the narrative began in the West about how the people fighting against Assad are Islamic extremists, the Salafists and Takfiris, as you mentioned. But isn't it time to really follow President Putin's example and bring this war to a close and do whatever we can to make sure that the legitimate Syrian government is able to restore order against the Al-Qaeda-backed groups and, of course, ISIS itself? Really, don't we need a 180-degree change in policy and to get involved, but on the right side, doing what we can, not by bombing, but by supporting the legitimate government?
Well, we do. We need a 180-degree turn. We need all international actors to combine to defeat these extremists. But where I think you and I just might part company, as you used the phrase legitimate government 3 times, is that that doesn't mean that the status quo ante of dictatorship in Syria is a viable future course for the country.
It's the only way to find a solution, but it was legitimate when Tony Blair went to see President Assad many years ago, and President Assad gave him a dressing down.
It was legitimate for him. It wasn't legitimate for me. I'm not Tony Blair. And Tony Blair was very happy to deal with the President Bashar. He put him up in the Queen's palace. And President Bashar al-Assad rode down the Mall in an open-top carriage. But let's accept the yardsticks of people like Tony Blair as being the ones that we should implement. Syria needs change. It needs transition. It needs democracy. It needs an end to one-party rule. It needs an end to ever all-pervasive intelligence community politics.
If we end the antagonism towards the government or regime, however you want to look at it, of President Assad, and make it more dependent on our goodwill, then of course it'd be more likely to change and evolve. And really I think the roadblock to peace is of course the West's refusal to deal with him and to recognise these ragtag forces and extremists as a legitimate government.
I know that I'm not in second place to you on that point, but the Kofi Annan plan at Geneva for transition to democratic system in Syria is still the right roadmap. And it's the one that the so-called international community deliberately turned its back on, forcing the resignation of Kofi Annan as the special envoy because they believed that the regime in Damascus would fall and that they could have a complete victory. I've said many, many times, the West hates Bashar not because of the bad things about the Syrian political system, but because of the good things. They hate Bashar because Syria will not sign a surrender peace with Israel. They hate Bashar because Syria would not expel the Palestinian resistance when nobody else would have them. They hate Bashar because Syria would not have participated, refused to participate in the invasion of Iraq and its occupation. They wanted Syria to be a knife in the back of Iraq. Bashar refused this. They hate Bashar because he will not cut his relations with the Lebanese resistance Hezbollah. They hate Bashar because he will not sever his relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they hate Bashar for the good things about the Syrian regime, not because it's one family rule. The West loves one family rule. They kiss the nose of every new family member who takes power in one family rule. They don't hate Bashar because it's a dictatorial system. They love dictatorial systems. They profit from dictatorial systems. I could go on, but I'm running out of time. Be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London. We took the cameras, as I said, out onto the streets of London to interview the public to see what they thought. Watch this.
To solve this problem?
Well, I think we certainly need to work together to solve the problem. If we have a coordinated approach and a united approach, then surely we'll get more done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important for that all countries can work together and solve this problem together, because one country can't help everyone, or a few.
Well, I think we certainly need to work together to solve the problem. If we have a coordinated approach and a united approach, then surely we'll get more done.
Definitely, they should come unite and they should make a special law for these refugees.
Absolutely, it's a great way to unite them, to share in the responsibility, yes.
Well, I think all the European countries need to play their own part. The reality is that some European countries are obviously much, much bigger than others and have a better financial infrastructure.
Let's carry on with the discussion here in the studio. Yes, madam?
Hi, my name is Rana. I want to start by saying that I agree with the gentleman about taking the steps Putin has taken to look for a political solution, and that's what they called for since the beginning of the problem in Syria. But I disagree with you by saying that Bashar al-Assad is a dictator. If he was a dictator, the people wouldn't run to elect him during this crisis. He had more than 50%, so he's not. He is elected by his own people. And now the people who are fleeing Syria, they wish they were still in the same. In their country under Bashar al-Assad's ruling, because they had everything they wanted to. They had all the social services we have here in the UK. They had it in Syria. They didn't own any penny to any country around the world because they could have supported themselves all the time. But now the European and the West and America, they did destroy Syria. First of all, because Assad is supporting the resistance and is destroying the dream of the Zionists to do their entity, their illegal entity from Iraq to Palestine. So the axis, or the allies between Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, as well as the Palestinian resistance, is putting an end to this dream. And inshallah, whatever they do, even if they destroyed Syria, and this is breaking our hearts, even if we're watching comedic shows showing the destruction in Syria, we cry, because Syria didn't do any harm to anyone, even the Arab people. Every refugee from Iraq, from every part of the world, even the Lebanese, when we had the war in 2006, they opened their doors to us. They had everyone in their country, even the Iraqi ones, the Palestinian. They get educated in Syria as well as the Syrian ones. They are treated like their own people. So Syria doesn't want all the Western people, Western country, to take its people as a refugee. As you said, the first step to solve the problem is to stop the war, and then they will start to rebuild their country, and they need funds to rebuild their country because they don't have any resources anymore. So everyone should unite to stop the war and stop this insane. You said that foreign policy in the UK and the West is insane. It is insane, and they should realize this. And I think one good result came out of this crisis, that people started to seeing this stupidity, and that's why they wanted change, and that's why Mr. Jeremy Corbyn was elected as a leader of the Labour, because people want peace, don't want any more wars. Thank you.
No, thank you. I agree with almost all of that, but we mustn't be more Catholic than the Pope. We mustn't be more royal than the King. Bashar al-Assad, if he was here, would not claim to be the leader of a democracy. Many of the social services and other attributes of progressive politics were actually abolished by Bashar al-Assad. They were introduced by his father. And Syria was a socialist country for many years. But Bashar al-Assad pursued neoliberal economic reforms of privatization and so on to please the Western leaders who are now trying to destroy him. So actually the Syrian system is much less, as you described it, under Bashar than it was under Hafez al-Assad. But under both of them, it is, by anybody's standards, a dictatorship. A dictatorship is where the president runs, nobody runs against him, and he gets 97% of the vote. That's a dictatorship. A dictatorship is where you have effectively a one-party state. A dictatorship is where the intelligence, the mukhabarat, are everywhere, listening to everybody. And if you take a different view, you get locked up. And if you get locked up, bad things happen to you. Bashar knows this. And Bashar, I believe, is the man to make the transition. But there needs to be a transition. We mustn't pretend otherwise, at least in my point of view. Yes,
let's get
and
back.
Then the lady behind you.
Let's get back to the refugees before you wrap up this discussion. The neighboring countries, obviously Jordan, Lebanon, are the most vulnerable, with Jordan having a lot of lack of resources, especially when it comes to water, and Lebanon already overburdened with its own problems. Now, the other countries are booming economically, the Gulf countries, the UAE, Qatar, with with all the projects that is taken for the World Cup. For every tower that is built in London, Berlin, or anywhere in Europe, there are 20 built in the Gulf. And those are a need for Arabic language speakers, for skilled labor, and so on. So why don't they share the burden of the refugees, instead of Turkey, which is becoming a porous border and supposedly a threat to Europe when it comes to that, while the Arab states control it very well, it seems, with other immigrants, so they might as well take some of their fellow Arabs. What do you think of that?
Why does a scorpion sting? They made the problem. A scorpion stings because it's a scorpion. These people made this disaster. These people you mentioned are the ones who are paying for this disaster. They are the ones who gave the money and the weapons and the propaganda channels to support this destruction of Syria. You think they're now going to say, okay, we'll take a big influx of Syrian refugees? They are afraid of Arabs. They are afraid of Muslims. Go to these countries. See who the immigrant labor are. Hardly any of them are Arabs. And hardly any of them are Muslim. They're afraid of Arabs and afraid of Muslims because they're afraid of being overthrown in their rotten, corrupt, perverted tyrannies. Don't get me started. Yes, madam.
Of course, this gentleman asked some part of my question. My question was that Europe opened its door to refugees. Do you think Europe did it under its legal obligations or under its political benefits, or because of a humanitarian or humanity, because we see in pictures or something? It is a little bit ambiguous. And the second part, which you answered, why didn't Arab countries open their doors to refugees?
The Arab countries are too busy destroying Syria to try and save it. Our friend, our expert, made the point right at the beginning. Everyone has the legitimate right to claim political asylum, but they must claim it in the first safe country in which they arrive. Our friend disagrees. That's my reading of the international law.
Yeah, under the European Union's interpretation, and now how they apply the rules under the Dublin Convention, and they've set the criteria that it's in the first safe country that you arrive you must claim asylum, but that's not in the 1951 protocol, which actually had its origins originally from 1926. But in the 1921 protocol, the 1921 and the 1967 protocol, it's actually any country you can go and claim, and you have the right to, if you're going to claim asylum, if you're a genuine refugee, to cross any borders to get to the country that you wish.
Well, here we get into a question of interpretation, like the occupied territories or les territoires occupés. My interpretation and the European Union's interpretation is that you must claim asylum in the first safe country that you arrive in. You can go to any country, of course, but you can't go from one safe country to another until you find one that you really wanted to go to in the first place but couldn't reach it. Now, I'm in favor of the suspension of that arrangement anyway. We have to have a fair and just distribution of refugees, because theoretically you could flee Turkey to Greece and say, I'm applying for political asylum in Greece. Everyone, millions upon millions upon millions, could all claim political asylum in Greece. That's not fair to Greece. Greece is already in a state of semi-economic collapse. I repeat again, for the avoidance of doubt, I'm against the refugees coming here at all. Not because I'm a hater of refugees, but because I believe, someone put it, that we're actually doing ISIS's work for them by helping empty these countries of refugees and picking and choosing where we can the best qualified and most economically active ones that we can. Yes, sir, at the back.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the gentleman at the front, would you ever wish to seek refuge in the home of a man who has destroyed yours? Saudi Arabia is not the solution. Saudi Arabia can never be the solution. Let us stop selling ourselves dreams and thinking that the salvation for Syria can ever come from Saudi Arabia or from Europe. They are the destroyers. They are not the people attempting to rescue us. So no, I would disagree with any narrative which begins to conclude or to even assume that that Europe or the instigators of this violence in Syria can ever begin to bring about any sort of rescue for the country. The Syrian population does not need the Saudi Arabians, it doesn't need the Europeans, it doesn't need the Americans. What we need is for a continuation of the Syrian Arab Republic to continue to be sovereign and independent as it always has been, and as it will continue to be. But I'm very pessimistic about this viewpoint that Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Europe can ever bring about a solution to the crisis, as has been discussed.
Well, of course, the foreign interference, invasion, and now occupation of Syria should never have happened. But as it has happened, we're going to need an international solution to it. And President Putin is the only major superpower that can, I think, help to bring it about. I think that Putin's idea of a return to the Geneva track is the only solution here. There's no return to the status quo ante. Half of the country is in the hands of foreigners, and of course some Syrian fighters, but most of these fighters are Chechens and Libyans and Tunisians and British and Scottish, Welsh, French, Dutch, Belgian, Takfiris. God knows what the Syrian people think of it all. Syria, for those who don't know it, was a highly sophisticated, developed society. A place where the idea that women should not work, or the idea that you can't sit with your wife in a restaurant, she's got to sit somewhere else. The idea that you should destroy, not cherish and protect, but destroy the holy places of others, is simply as far from the mindset of the vast majority of Syrians as it is possible to imagine.
Well, before you finish, can I interrupt you?
Yes,
does that mean
you can have the last word. Go on.
Well, the lady there as well. Does that mean Iran is backwards when it comes to gender segregation and women's rights on that notion?
Actually, women have a very strong position in Iran. I go to Press TV in Tehran and women are running it. Women are driving. Women are present everywhere in the public sphere. You have as skewed an idea of Iranian society as you appear to do about Saudi Arabian society and their ability to help this process. Unfortunately, I've run out of time.
But you forgot Yemen.
I did forget Yemen, but I can't deal with everything in one show. I'll have to deal with Yemen another time. It's been marvelous. Thanks very much for joining me.